We've got a pretty good sized crowd this morning. We're so glad to see you in our Sunday morning Bible class. We invite your attention to Matthew chapter 12. So we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 12 today. We finished chapter 11 on Wednesday night, and we'll notice chapter 12 hopefully today and then move on to chapter 13. I want to talk about some differences between the old and new law today. Okay? I'm reminded of a young boy, and he got a new watch for Christmas. And anyway, his brother was admiring his watch. He said, "Man, that watch is cool." But his older brother began to pick on him. He said, "You don't even know what time it is." The little brother, he said, "Yes, I do. I know what time it is." And the older brother, he said, "Well, tell me." The younger brother said, "It's time for you to go." The old law had a time when it was time for it to be set aside. The new law replaced it, but I want to share some things with you today that maybe you probably hadn't noticed before. Okay? Let's look here at Matthew chapter 12 and verse 1. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungry. And they began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." And he said unto them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungered, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God, and he did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for them to eat, and neither for them which were with them, but only for the priest. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple, they profane the Sabbath, but are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. And if you had known what that mean, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath day." Now there's a lot of information in there, and there's a lot of things that we could discuss. But first, I want to talk about the Sabbath day. Now, what exactly is the Sabbath day? What does that mean when they say that?
It was a day of rest on the last day of the week.
That's right. It was a day of rest on the last day of the week. Now, what were they allowed to do on the Sabbath day?
Wasn't allowed to do any kind of work.
Okay, no work. They couldn't gather crops. They could only go a certain amount of steps away from their house. So they couldn't go on journeys. The gates of the city were shut on the Sabbath day. Okay? So you got several different things that are happening as far as the Sabbath goes. Let's go to Exodus chapter 16, verses 25 through 28. So picture this. Jesus, being a Jew, he is accountable to the law of Moses. He's walking through this field on the Sabbath day. And he's walking through the field and he is picking food to eat. And they said, "Oh, he's gathering crops. He's breaking the Sabbath day." But I think the more we look into this, you'll see there's not a violation here at all. All right, Exodus chapter 16, verses 25 through 28. Will somebody read that for us?
Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, and on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none." Now it happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?"
Okay. So there are certain stipulations then about the Sabbath day. Now, I have some other scriptures here I want to share with you just for a moment. In chapter 12 and verse 10, it says, "There was a man which had a hand withered. They asked him, saying, and he asked them, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days, that they might accuse him?" Now, what we're going to find is, in Matthew chapter 12, when they say that Jesus is breaking the law, there are several things that I noticed. Number one, they're not interested in the law at all. Okay?
They had written in something like catch him in.
You're exactly right. This last phrase is the key to what's going on in this chapter. Okay? Number one, they're not concerned with who Jesus is. They're not concerned with the Old Testament law. The only thing they're concerned with is the fact that they might catch him in something. I mean, think about it. I'll give you some scriptures here, and what I did is I tried to go through the book of Matthew and see how many times I found this idea. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 3, Jesus came to the scribes and Pharisees which were of Jerusalem, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." But he answered and said to them, "Why do you transgress the commandment of God by your tradition?" So it's funny to me. They sit down and they watch Jesus' disciples and they say, "Oh, well, they don't even fulfill the traditions because they don't even wash their hands before they eat." And it's almost like Jesus is saying, who cares? It doesn't matter. In fact, he said in another passage, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles a man, but what? What comes out of your mouth. So what he does then, when they accuse him, he always turns the focus right back. He said, okay, if you think it's important to wash your hands, what if you don't wash your heart? Then they start to think, well, he may be right. You go forward in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 1. The Pharisees also came with the Sadducees, and they were tempting, desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. They're trying to say, if you say that you are the Son of God, then show us. Chapter 19, verse 3, the Pharisees also came to him, tempting him, saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause?" And you know what they tried to do? Because Jesus was teaching against divorce for every cause. So they said, all right, let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 24. That's what they said to Jesus, basically. And in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 5, you're going to read about Moses who gave an exception to write a bill of divorcement. And they say, all right, if you're the Son of God, then answer that. And he did. They're just trying to accuse it. Chapter 22, these are all in the book of Matthew, by the way. We could go, and I've got two that are outside the book of Matthew, but I just stayed in the book of Matthew. One of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, saying, "Master, which is the great commandment in the law?" You see this repetitive thing that's going on. Luke chapter 11. He said these things unto them. The scribes and Pharisees began to urge him vehemently to provoke him, to speak many things, laying in wait for him. You know, we're just waiting. Let me see what I can pull up on him. They were seeking to catch him out of his mouth that they might accuse him. And then the last one that I have here is in John 8. Scribes and Pharisees brought a woman taken in adultery. When they had set her in the midst, they say to him, "Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say about that?" Well, if it were left to them, they would have killed that lady right there in front of everybody. And Jesus, he was not going to allow that to happen. So, when I'm reading Matthew chapter 12, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a group of people who, number one, are not interested in Jesus. Number two, they're not interested in the law. They're just trying to find some dirt. But the problem was, every single one of those Pharisees had a lot of dirt of their own. So this was a big deal to Jesus, and he was not going to allow this to slide. Now, let's talk about this Sabbath. I meant to introduce this ahead of time, apologize for that, but we read Exodus chapter 16 a moment ago about what could not be done on the Sabbath day. Now I want to ask your thoughts. Is Jesus breaking the Sabbath? And if not, how could you prove that? What would you say?
Well, he's not gathering on the Sabbath.
Okay,
He just getting something to eat and get him over to the next day.
that's true. That's right. Sure enough. I think those... Yeah, that's right. It's kind of hard to break something that you created. But I think that both of those principles are true. In fact, Jesus himself said that. He said, someone even greater than the Sabbath is here in your midst. So to me, that's a key to this idea. Now, I want to give you one more, and then I'm going to notice a little bit of discussion here about something that maybe you never saw or thought of. Let's go to Exodus 31 first. I want to go to Exodus 31, verses 14 through 17. Let's talk a little bit more about what this Sabbath is. Let me ask you this. Is there such thing as a Christian Sabbath? Nope. All right, Brad says no. What do you think? I would say no. You know, sometimes you hear people, and I've even heard this myself, somebody will say, you know, my parents, when we were coming up, they didn't even let us play outside on Sunday. You know, we couldn't go out in the yard and do any work on Sunday. My daddy, he never cut the grass on Sunday. You ever heard stuff like that? Now, I think it's sort of a mix-up between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and also what the Sabbath is and whether or not we're supposed to keep it today. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Will somebody read Exodus 31, verses 14 through 17?
Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Anyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel observed the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed.
Okay. It's interesting in verse 17, he said, it is a sign between me and who? The children of Israel. Is anyone in this room an Israelite? No. You see, something that I learned pretty early on when I became a Christian is, and I'm glad that somebody showed me because I probably never would have seen it on my own. The Old Testament law was not given to Gentiles. Now, what do I mean by Gentile? What does that mean? Everybody except the children of Israel. You had Jews from the nation of Israel, and then everyone else is a Gentile. Something that you'll find in the Old Testament is God did not make the Sabbath covenant with Gentiles. He did not give the Ten Commandment law to the Gentiles. He gave that to the children of Israel. You say, well, preacher, you got to show me that in the Bible. All right? Let's go over Exodus chapter 34, just a few chapters, verses 27 and 28. You say, how do I know that the Old Testament was not given to Gentiles? This is the path. I have it highlighted in my Bible. If it were me, I would mark this one. This is very important. The Lord said to Moses, write thou these words, for after the tenor of these words I have made a covenant with thee and with who? With Israel. He tells us what the covenant is. And he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water. And he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant. And what covenant is that? The Ten Commandments. That Ten Commandment law, which included Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it was not ever intended for Gentile nations. It was intended for one nation, the nation of Israel. So that's very important when you're studying the difference between the Old and New Testaments, because I'll tell you, friend, that Old Testament law never applied to me to begin with. Is it wrong still to murder? Well, yes, but it was wrong to murder before the Ten Commandments were given. Is it wrong to steal or to commit adultery or to bear false witness? Well, yes, but it was wrong to do all those things before the Ten Commandment law was given. The reason why God gave this covenant, you'll read this in Galatians chapter 3, he said is because of their transgressions. Somebody got a message. Well, let's talk about then this idea of a Christian Sabbath, okay? Because to me, this is a deeper side to this when you think about the difference between Jews and Gentiles, but it's important today because it was never intended for me as a Gentile to keep the Sabbath day anyway. God did not make that covenant with any other nation. Asia, Africa, India, none of those. So when we think about a Christian Sabbath, number one, you don't read of the Sabbath in the New Testament further than the cross. That's when the Old Testament law ended, by the way, at the cross of Jesus. We'll look at that in just a moment. But I have a question. What about in the book of Acts when you read about all these Jewish people and they're still doing Jewish things? Can you think about some things in the book of Acts right now that the Jews were still doing? Okay, yeah, some of them were still practicing circumcision. In fact, there was a dispute as to whether or not Timothy should be circumcised. I think they went ahead and circumcised him, didn't they? They went ahead and did. Even though his father was a Gentile, his mother was Jewish, there was a dispute among the disciples whether or not he should be circumcised. And Paul, he didn't want to cause any problems, so he said, you know what? We need to go ahead and do this. And he did. Where were they meeting? Do you remember where these people were meeting most of the time?
In the temple?
The apostles went in that temple and worshiped. Multiple times. So what you have is, you have this idea of the old law being set aside. The Jewish system is no longer in effect to save people anymore. The blood of Jesus has now taken its place. What's neat about the blood of Jesus is, and the New Testament, it includes every nation, not just one. So you've got this awesome thing that has happened when Jesus died, and you'll read about this in Galatians chapter 3 when he said about the promise made to Abraham that all nations would be blessed through him. That's a prophecy about Jesus replacing the Old Testament law. So, you've got this problem though. The old law has been set aside, but you still have Jewish people worshiping in the temple, and they are still doing Jewish things. And I will tell you this, they are still offering sacrifices. So how do you reconcile that? All right, let's look at Colossians chapter 2. Now I realize if you're hearing this for the first time, this is going to be pretty difficult. But as a teacher, I try my very best. I don't succeed all the time. And I try my best to feed both the younger and the older Christians. Now, some of you have been studying for a long time. This will be a good subject for you if you've been studying for quite some time. Will somebody read Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 16?
Circumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with them, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath.
There was a man, he went to the doctor and he said, you know, I woke up this morning, my skin was wrinkled, my hair was gray, my hair is frizzy, and I really just look terrible as I get older. The doctor was joking with him. He said, well, I got some good news for you. You got good eyes. Now, when I talk about this, I want us to try to see something a little clearer, okay? Why is it that even in the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul himself, he told Jews to keep the law of Moses? Why did he do that? If you're telling me, if the Bible is telling me that the Old Testament law has been set aside, it has been nailed to the cross, so we don't have to worry about feast days anymore, or festivals, or Sabbaths, or new moons, or what we eat or drink. You know, they couldn't eat pigs, they couldn't eat certain foods. If he says, okay, all that's been set aside, then please tell me why in the Old Testament law and in Acts chapter 21, he told these Jewish people to live in observance of the law.
So you think they were living under two different laws? At the same time?
I don't know.
I think a lot of it has to do with the old saying, old habits die hard, and there's a majority of the Jews out there that continue to do that. So I'd say that they continue to do that just because of the majority, and it goes against the social mores of the time.
Yeah.
Brother Josh, I'd like to make a comment.
Sure.
We have an obligation to the world and the gospel into all the world. Every creature. Now, if these Jewish Christians, if they don't continue to follow the law and that sort of thing, they will not be a very effective evangelists among their people. So, I think that they were not doing it for their salvation, but for those Jews who didn't believe in Christ. They were trying to take Christ to them, just like that we try to take Christ to our Gentile brothers and sisters. So I think it had to do with more about fulfilling our obligation to take the gospel into the world.
Yeah.
These Jews are the only ones that we've been able to have gone into the temple to do the sacrifices and so forth. Gentiles were forbidden from going into certain parts of the temple. So I don't see that, as long as they were not doing it for their salvation, but doing it to save the lost, I think God would smile upon them when the Jews were doing that.
Yeah.
I think that that's what Paul was doing when he was going to the Jews.
Yeah, I kind of believe the same. And by the way, I haven't said anything about what I believe until right now. So you can't say that I said anything. All I did was present the scriptures. So I'm asking the question, why? Now, I will tell you what I believe as why, but I haven't mentioned it as to yet until now.
Josh, comment on what Mark said, Paul said, the Jew became a Jew, the Gentile became a Gentile. So
Yeah.
he might do something.
Yeah, in fact, that's sort of going to be my answer to this. There is a transition period to me that had to happen in order for the Jews to take the gospel to the world. I mean, you think about it. Jesus had to convert the Jews first. And that's not easy to do. So let's picture that you're a Jewish man. You've lived under the old law your whole life, and it's so strict. I mean, you can recite the Old Testament almost word for word in your mind. And all of a sudden, Jesus comes on the scene and dies for you, and you have to change everything you believe religiously. You know, there's no more worshiping at the temple. There's no more animal sacrifices. You don't have to keep these feast days anymore. And I'll tell you, it would transgress their conscience almost to think, I don't have to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year anymore. Think about that. You've been converted to something you've known your whole life, and all of a sudden it just comes to a screeching halt, and you think, wait a minute. I feel like I'm transgressing my conscience if I don't go in the doors of that temple. So to me, I think that's what's happening. You've got a transition period, and Paul tells him, let's just read it. When he had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly, and on the following day, Paul went in with us, and James and the elders were present. After greeting him, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. So he said, look, we've been going out and teaching these people, and they're responding. It's amazing what God is doing, is what he's saying. When they heard it, they glorified God. They said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. And they're all zealous for the law. They're still wanting to keep the Jewish traditions. They've been told that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to our customs. And you know what he told them? Don't tell them that. Don't tell them they have to leave the customs. Don't tell them that they're not supposed to circumcise their children anymore. He said that they need to live in observance to that. The question is why? He said there arose a certain sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them, to command them to keep the law of Moses. And the apostles and elders, they came together to consider this matter. Where then there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said to them, men and brethren, you know how that a good while ago God made choice among us, that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, which knows the hearts, bear them witness and give them the Holy Ghost, even as he did unto us. He put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. So you've got this other thing that happened in Acts 15 where they disputed amongst each other. I think my slide jumped ahead there, and I apologize for that. But at any rate, you have this dispute then that's going on. Do the Jews become Gentiles, or do the Gentiles become Jews? And you know what he said? Neither one. They both need to become Christians. The Jews can keep their customs according to what they want to keep. If they want to keep the Sabbath day and they want to remember the Sabbath day, let them do it. They can do that anytime they want. But they can't tell the Gentile that he has to do it. See, he said, I don't want the Jews to become Gentiles. I don't want the Gentiles to become Jews. I want them both to become Christians. And this temple that you're looking at, one day, it's going to be gone. The whole Jewish system is going to be gone in AD 70. Let's keep reading. What then is to be done? That's the question. What do we do about this problem then? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Okay, they've taken the Nazirite vow, the strictest part of the law that you could have. He said, take these men, purify yourself among them, and pray their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Why would they do that if they're not keeping the old law? He said, no, they made a vow and they're going to keep it. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself live in observance of the law. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. He gave 2 different things for Jewish people and for Gentile people. Why? I'm just curious. Yes. Sure enough.
When you came here, when you get ready to give out the invitation at the last day, you always say that we are, our sins are forgiven by the blood of Christ, and that the blood is in the body. And when we are baptized, we're added to the church and we become part of that body. And you've always told us that the only thing that washes away sin is the blood of Christ. Yeah. And you taught us from the first day that you were here that we're not saved by righteous works, that we can't do righteous works, righteous Gentile works, let's say. We can do them from now until the Lord comes back and won't forgive one sin. But the blood of Christ forgives us our sins and washes us away. Well, the same exact thing is happening to these Jews. It's not the law is holy, just, and good. But you can do the acts of the law from now till judgment day. It won't save one sin.
Yeah.
It won't forgive one sin. But when they were baptized in Christ, just as we were baptized in Christ, they were admitted into the body of Christ, and they're saved by the blood of Christ. It's not going to be Jewish works. It's not going to be Gentile works that saves. It's going to be that blood of Christ. It saves both of us. And it says in there that we're not supposed to make a difference between Jews and Gentiles, man or women. So the same thing that saves men saves women. It's the blood of Christ.
Yeah.
The same thing that saves Jews is the same thing that saves Gentiles.
Yeah.
The blood of Christ.
That's true. And I believe that's exactly what is said here in Colossians chapter 2. That's his entire point. He says Jesus died on the cross to take away all these responsibilities that they had to keep under the old law. But he also said if a man feels like he wants to keep the feast, nobody can judge him. Let him keep the feast. If he feels like it's going to transgress his conscience if he doesn't remember the Sabbath day, he's been brought up that way. He said, don't leave him alone. Don't be judging him. You see, I think why we cannot relate to this in our culture is because we don't have any Jewish people in this room. We can't understand what it's like for a Jewish man to be a member of the church. We're all Gentiles. But in the first century, you come to church on Sunday morning, and guess what you see? Half of the people are Jewish, and half of the people are Gentiles. And he said, y'all got to learn to live together. You know, this brother, this Jewish brother that is now your brother in Christ, he's got a lot of baggage. Okay? He has been converted from something that is very strict. And then you have the Gentile brother who's got a lot of baggage because he's been converted from something that is very liberal. You know what I mean? He's been partying it up and living it up his whole life. And all of a sudden, these people are baptized into Christ and they come to church on Sunday morning and they got to figure out how to mesh together in their religious views. So to me, it's not a contradiction in the Bible. You know, some people will say, this is a contradiction. Why did Paul tell those Jews to remember the old law? Well, to me, it's not a contradiction at all. It's God being very, very patient and long-suffering, allowing these people to grow out of this religion that they have been converted from. So, to me, that's my answer. That's my view. I don't know any other view that would be more effective than that. If you know something better, I would be certainly open. But somehow these verses have to come together because I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've seen the summed up on in Colossians 2, verse 16.
So,
Colossians 2, verse 16. He's addressing that in the first part of that verse.
okay, yeah. Is it not on the screen there? Yes, sir. I believe he does address that.
So let no one judge you. That's
Uh-huh.
the whole deal.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. You know, he says, look, let's just be patient now. Let these people learn that they don't have to keep the festivals anymore. Like Mr. Mark said, it's not going to matter in the end. It's not going to save this Jewish brother if he keeps the Sabbath day. It doesn't matter. But to him, this is part of his lifestyle, and it becomes, in my view, it becomes a custom. It is a Jewish custom that is part of his life.
Another thing, Josh, about the Sabbath, they were commanded to rest. They were also commanded to remember that this day, Lord. They were to remember that the Lord brought them out of Egypt on each Sabbath.
That's true.
Bondage and freedom and stuff.
That's true.
It's just hard to just quit. I mean, I can see you still doing that and suddenly going to worship them too.
Yeah.
You just want to remember that.
Yeah, you're right. So anyway, I present this because a lot of times people don't know about this. You know, they've read the Bible, they may have even read these verses, but it never jumps off the pages and they say, well, what do we do about this? Well, my view is the Jews and the Gentiles had different customs. They had to learn how to live together despite what they had been taught in the past. Okay? But as far as the Sabbath goes, there is no Christian Sabbath. That is a Jewish custom, a Jewish part of the old law that is no longer in effect today. You know, me and my father-in-law discussed this, and he said, you know, I really don't have an answer either. And I just finally told him, I said, you know what? That law never applied to me to begin with. You know, I'm a Gentile. So, as far as what people believe on it, they can believe what they want, but the bottom line is, I'm not Jewish. All right, I'm going to mention what Kenny said a minute ago, and then I'm going to move on. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19, he said, though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself a servant to all, that I might gain the more. Now notice, to the Jews I became as a Jew. So if I had a Jewish man come into service and I was trying to convert him, I need to know this. I need to know all about this, because I'll tell you, what can happen is we'll say, well, all your customs that you believe, they're false. And you know what he'll do? This right here. So we have to be careful.